morning, church.
Good morning.
It's good to be back today after being gone last Sunday. And I think rather than reading the scripture like I normally do, we're going to read it through the course of this message. But let me just begin by making a statement. And that statement is everybody needs encouragement. Would you agree? Everybody needs encouragement. This past weekend, when I was along with about 30 plus other Kairos volunteers, when we were at the Martin Correctional Institution, we went into there and we shared Christ with these guys. And you know, most of those guys, in reality, deserve to be there. Okay? There may be an occasional exception where maybe somebody's been wrongfully convicted, but as a rule, those guys deserve to be there. I'm not suggesting that all the time that justice is meted equitably, for everybody, but those guys generally deserve to be there. And can you imagine being in prison, okay? Who knows, maybe one of you have been in there, I don't know, but just imagine being in prison and, that would be a pretty sad situation. I'm not just thinking of the prison food and all the things that go on there, but just to be in prison and, to look back over your life as these guys certainly would have to do and, say, what have I done with my life? And imagine if you went to prison and you got a life sentence. And the guys who have a life sentence there, it's not just a few of them. I mean, it's a fair percentage, not a majority, but it's not a small percentage either. At least that's been my experience. Just imagine going to prison and you got regrets for your past, things you've done, perhaps harm you've done to people, and you've really got perhaps little, if any, future to look forward to. And that's enough to, I think, as is pretty common in prison from what I gather, that's enough to make you just want to take drugs. That's what a lot of those guys do, just to escape reality. It's a huge problem. I would think probably the majority of them are doing that just to escape the dismal life that they live in. And of course, we go there and we offer these guys hope, okay? We offer them forgiveness. They can find forgiveness through Jesus Christ. They can find, hope of a life beyond this life. They can find a purpose and a reason to live. Even if they're going to have to spend the rest of their life behind bars, as some of them will, it gives them a reason to live. I can live for God. God's going to, give me something better with my life. I can be like a missionary for Him, to the inmates that I have to live in, whether it be here or in a different institution. It gives purpose to their lives. And that really is, I think, encouragement that we offer these guys. And when you look at the New Testament, there's a word that you'll find there occasionally. It's the Greek word parakletos. Sometimes we have it in English, we just call it the paraclete. And that's a term used for the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit basically is being called a comforter or an encourager. And that's what we're talking about today, this idea of encouragement, okay? And encouragement can find its way in different ways. It may just be through a kind word, a gesture, a kind deed, a note or a letter, or just a listening ear. There's different ways we can encourage people. And when we look at this passage that we'll be looking at today in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, it kind of has what one guy called the cycle of encouragement. In other words, Paul encouraged the Corinthians encouraged Titus encouraged Paul. It's like a cycle, okay? And that happens even in life. I mean, it's kind of uncanny to me how that when I went into the prison last weekend, along with other guys, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We came back this past Saturday, yesterday, and we always have what we call an instructional. We try to get these guys, after they've gone through this 4-day Kairos weekend, to get involved in prayer and share groups, okay? We're not going to be there just to be able to hold their hands on a regular basis. We go back maybe once a month, okay, for a reunion. But, how are those guys going to survive day after day if they're Christians or try to be Christians unless they have some Christian community to help them? And so we try to get them involved in prayer and share groups with each other, just like we Kairos volunteers do on the outside, okay? And so that's what that instructional was about that we had yesterday. And when I got there, where we were there in the chapel, the guy that I was sitting next to for that weekend last week, there's like 3 of us Kairos volunteers around a table, and then there's 2 inmates between each of us, so there's 6 inmates and 3 volunteers. And I'm always at a table because I'm one of the clergy on the Kairos team, and we're kind of in short demand, okay? We had 6 tables, but we only had really 4 clergy, so they had to kind of, draft some unofficial clergy at the other tables, okay? But at any rate, the one guy that I was sitting next to, one guy on each side, but one guy in particular, I mean, he really kind of talked my ear off. But, I don't mind. I listen and, try to encourage him. Well, he really encouraged me when I came back yesterday. He brought me this here piece of paper. You can't see it, okay? I realize that. But, I mean, this guy is an artist. I mean, everything you see on this thing, this guy drew, and then he wrote a real nice note, or letter, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that was kind of like a cycle of encouragement. We're there to encourage him, and those guys encourage us. That always happens, and this was particularly encouraging when that guy gave that to me. But when we think about this cycle of encouragement, though, from Paul's writing here in 2 Corinthians 7, there's really 3 points that we want to look at this morning. And the first of those points, as we have on our screen there, is Paul encouraged the Corinthians. He encouraged the Corinthians. Now, why did that church need encouragement? Well, quite simply, if you know what the New Testament teaches, that Corinthian church had problems. And Paul had to address those issues, not only in the 2 letters that we have of his, but even in at least 1 or 2 other letters that we don't have of his, okay? And he also paid those Corinthians what's usually been called a painful visit at some point. And so here's Paul writing a letter to these guys, again, that Titus is going to deliver to them. We don't have it. And, he's hoping these guys will take what he has to say. I gather it's kind of a letter of rebuke or censure. And he's hoping that they'll accept it. But, at the same time, he also wants to try to offer some encouragement to them, okay? And when we think about encouragement, it can't always just be encouragement all the time. Sometimes you got to tell people the hard truth. If all you do is ever say good things to them, you wonder if they're really just flattering you or not. It's kind of like what we read in the Old Testament, Proverbs 27:5 and 6, okay? It says, "Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." In other words, if all we ever get, okay, is praise, if all you ever get is praise and criticism, okay, and no criticism, I should say, you begin to wonder if it's for real. If all it is flattery. It's like you go to buy a suit, if the suit salesman says, "Boy, that looks just right on you. That's the right color, perfect fit. That suit is yours." I mean, if that's all he ever says to you, you wonder if he's really being truthful to you. Or perhaps it's you as a parent. If what you ever do is praise your kids, but there's never any discipline, you're going to begin to lose effectiveness with them. Or if it's a coach, if a coach all he does is, tell the team how good they are, that's going to probably end up being a team that's just lazy and overconfident. It's not good. Even a minister, we know from what the New Testament teaches, is to rebuke as well as to encourage. Okay? 2 Timothy 4:2 and Titus 2:15 would certainly tell us that. This past weekend when I was at the prison, okay, not yesterday, but the weekend before, I gave a talk on Sunday, okay. We basically, during this whole 4-day thing, and really it's mostly it's the last 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we basically have 10 talks that we present, and all these talks are kind of connected together, okay. So they're largely scripted. I mean, you have to personalize each talk, but each talk needs to be followed. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense when you get to the next talk and the next talk. So it's like one big talk broken up into 10 pieces, as it were. Well, I had the next to the last talk on Sunday, okay? And that particular talk was called Walking in God's Grace, okay? These inmates were getting ready, on Sunday to leave. Okay, it's almost like they've had a mountaintop experience, as it were, and now they've got to go down into the valley, as it were, back into the compound, and they've got to try to, live what they've heard, and that's not going to be easy. And so you have that one talk called Walking in God's Grace. Well, after I got done with that talk, one of my fellow volunteers, Dan Waller, said, you really hit a home run with that talk. Now, it's just not uncommon for people to, compliment you when you have a talk, But, that was particularly meaningful when Dan said that, because some weeks prior to, us going into the prison, we always have to present our talk, to at least 3 other guys there at one of our meetings so they can critique it. And so Dan was one of those 3 guys that critiqued my talk, and he was the only one that really said, maybe you need to change it a little bit, at least the introduction, because you want to try to get these guys' attention from the very start. And, of course, the way that talk was written, it just wouldn't happen very well. So I did revise it and change it, because I knew exactly what he was telling you. You need to try to get these people's attention from the very start, especially when it's a talk right after lunch, when they're most prone to go to sleep. That's the reality of the situation. And so when Dan said after that talk, you definitely hit a home run with that talk, I appreciated that. I know it wasn't one just to tell you that, because earlier he'd given me some criticism, some constructive criticism, as it were. And so when Paul expressed approval and encouragement, to these believers there in Corinth, okay, he basically did it in 3 ways, okay. He expressed it, one, by a life of integrity. We read in verse 2 of our passage, the first verse, he says, we have wronged no one, we have corrupted no one, we have exploited no one. That's what Paul says. Now, typically in a church, the finances are not something that the minister handles. And that's the case here, and that's the case, about any church. It's not something the minister would handle. But in the case of Paul, Paul was involved in the finances, of that day. And it's not that the finances that Paul was handling was like of a particular church. These were the finances of money that was being collected to help the poor saints back in Jerusalem. So if you're familiar with the New Testament, you know that. So Paul was involved in that, and perhaps he had some people that were critical of him, saying that, he was being less than honest with it. But Paul says that's not the case at all. We haven't corrupted or defrauded or done anything inappropriate, and it's rare to have such an honest man. It's an encouraging thing, and that's how Paul was. So he expressed encouragement by a life of integrity, but he also expressed it to them by his sacrificial spirit. Verse 3 of our text says this. He says, you have such a place in our hearts that I would live or die with you. Imagine somebody saying that to you. You have such a place in my heart that I would live or die with you. That's what Paul wrote in this document that we're reading today from almost 2,000 years ago. He was willing to sacrifice for these people. And even in verse 5 of our text, he says, for when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. Paul had his troubles, okay? But he endured those difficulties because he cared for those people. It's been said, when it comes to people going into work, some people call in sick, some people crawl in sick. Now, while we don't necessarily want to get around those people that crawl in sick, we do have to admire the fact that, they don't just call in sick. They're going to be there. They let you know that they're serious about their work, and that can be encouraging. That's how it was for the famous baseball player, Lou Gehrig. I read that he often played baseball with at least one broken finger. So imagine what sort of encouragement that would be to his teammates, okay? And the Apostle Paul, he had conflicts, he had adversities, he had illnesses, he had things he had to deal with. And yet he says here, I'd live or die with you, Corinthians. He thought that much of them. But Paul also encouraged them, okay, the Corinthians, by his words of affirmation. He expressed confidence in them. In verse 4 of our text, he says this, I take great pride in you. I am greatly encouraged by you. It's always good when somebody says, I'm proud of you. That's what Paul was saying, okay? He mixed his rebukes with his words of encouragement. So the people knew that he was telling them the truth. He wasn't just simply trying to flatter them. I remember when I got my first C in citizenship. This is over 50 years ago in grade school. That was a big deal because I think for about 3 years prior, I got straight Fs. And so when I finally got a C, I knew the teacher wasn't just trying to flatter me. I was finally learning to behave myself, at least to some degree. I got a C. And that encouraged me. But that brings us to our second point of encouragement, okay, in this cycle of encouragement. And that is, namely, that Titus encouraged Paul, okay? Paul encouraged the Corinthians, but Titus encouraged Paul. We read in verse 5. It says, when we came into Macedonia, this body of ours, talking about his physical body, this body of ours had no rest. But we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. Now, you might not normally think of Paul as somebody who'd be afraid. I mean, when we read about this great man, the Apostle Paul, certainly the best missionary of the first century, when we read about him in the New Testament, you might think he was fearless. But that may be, incorrect. I mean, he didn't like being beaten, jailed, persecuted, tortured, shipwrecked, whatever he went through, okay? He didn't like that, I'm sure, any more than we would. And he perhaps had the worries about these churches, Is this church going to survive? Is this church going to make it? Is somebody going to come in and just tear this church up? I mean, that was a concern that he had. And perhaps sometimes he even worried about his own staying power, Am I going to be able to hang in there? Which he did. He struggled with exhaustion. He struggled with opposition, apprehension. He too needed encouragement, even the great Apostle Paul. I'm kind of reminded of a story that 60 Minutes, the news program, had some years ago about the day President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed in 1865. There were 3 things that were found on his body after he'd been killed. A pocket knife, some Confederate currency, and in his wallet there was found this piece of paper, an article, a newspaper article, that obviously had been there for some time and obviously had been taken out and read, and folded back up and put back in because it had frayed edges around it, okay? But this article was basically by a British writer named Bright, who basically said, I realize that, most Americans are critical of Lincoln. His popularity wasn't that good. But he said, I believe Lincoln is going to go down as one of the greatest presidents the United States has ever had. And you can just imagine President Lincoln, perhaps after a long, hard day, going back to the White House, to the living quarters there, perhaps getting in a corner of the room there with his oil lamp and unfolding that piece of paper and just reading it, simply to get some encouragement because he believed that somebody believed in him. That would be an encouraging thing. And if it's the really powerful and secure people that need encouragement, what about the average Joe like you and me? I mean, we probably need it even more when we're insecure and struggling in life. I remember about 10 years ago or so when I was working with a church in Port St. Lucie, Kim and I would work with the youth there. And it wouldn't be every single week, but, it was during church, kind of like Sunday school. And it'd be every other week, maybe every third week. I don't remember exactly. It'd be kind of a rotation type system. But I'd bring in some sort of sweet treat to the youth there. And Kim reminded me this morning that I'd bring in bunt cake sometimes, and the kids would say, well, that's butt cake, huh? No, it's bunt cake, okay? But I'd bring in some cake there. And, those kids just enjoyed when I was the teacher that week. And sometimes I would offer a challenge, like one challenge I remember was if you can memorize the books of the Bible, all 66 of them, and recite them, I'll give you $5. And I had at least 1 or 2 of them do that. So I would try to encourage those youth when I was there, while they were there, to keep coming back and to learn and that sort of thing. And you can do the same thing, okay? Sometimes your encouragement may take the form of a note. It may be a phone call. It may be a text message. It may be a visit, whatever. But we've got to try to encourage each other, okay? And one thing that really thrills most Christian leaders, I think more than anything else, is a changed life, a repentant spirit. One guy that was at this weekend, at Kairos, an inmate, I was like his sponsor. Now, when you go to Kairos, of course, as an inmate, you don't know anybody there. I mean, as far as us Kairos volunteers. And so it can be a little awkward, obviously, depending on your personality. And so the first night, Thursday afternoon, when they come in, we always have somebody who's like a sponsor, and then one of the inmates will be a sponsoree. And so the two of you get together, and you talk a little bit, and you got a little list of questions that you go through to kind of familiarize yourself with each other, and then the whole group kind of does it as a whole, And that's mostly what the Thursday evening program consists of. That's the majority of what it is, really. And so the guy that I had was a guy that was in his, probably about 50 years old. And this guy, from what I could gather, has just been on drugs pretty much his whole life. But about a week to 10 days prior to this Kairos event, he says, I'm going to try to give up the drugs. He hadn't smoked any K2 or whatever it was that he used for the last week to 10 days. And during our time there on the weekend, these inmates can, if they so choose, they can get some counseling, or they just may want to talk with one of the clergy there. So I ended up having 2 or 3 sessions like that, as I recall. And then one of those sessions was with this guy, okay? And one of the things that was kind of bothering him that he wanted to talk to me about was, hey, I'm going to try to quit these drugs, but I don't know if I can. What happens if I get back on them? And I simply said, even if you get back on them and you don't succeed and you fall off the wagon, as it were, just pick yourself up and keep on going. Just because you fail doesn't mean you are a failure forever. You just pick yourself up and keep on going. But I said, even beyond that, something you need to do is find you an accountability partner, somebody that can help to hold you accountable. And long story short, this guy here, he ends up, he's going to have his bunkmate, the guy that sleeps with him in the cell, who's gone through Kairos sometime prior, but who's also struggled with drugs. He decided he wanted to get off drugs too at the same time. And when I saw this guy just yesterday, I said, well, how you doing? You hanging in there? He said, yeah. So here's a guy that's been off drugs along with his roommate for at least 2.5 weeks. But they're going to hold each other accountable, okay? And that was encouraging to me to see that he had a plan to succeed. That's what you need. Paul says in verse 9 of our text, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, now I am happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us. Now, needless to say, there's a big difference between godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. I think we all realize that, okay? And I would say there's at least 4 differences between godly sorrow or godly repentance and worldly sorrow. The first difference would be this. Godly sorrow is remorseful over sin. You're not just sorry that you got caught. You're sorry for what you did, and you want to try to change. That's the first difference. Second difference would be this. Godly sorrow is evidenced by a penitent attitude. You want to change, okay? Last week, when my former classmate Alan Tyson was here, he talked about Zacchaeus. I listened to it online. And one of the things that always struck me about Zacchaeus is he said, I'm going to give away half of what I have. He had a lot to the poor. And if I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to pay them back 4-fold. Now, it seems to me, if you do the numbers, that guy could not have done too much defrauding. I mean, he wouldn't have the resources to pay people back. If he's only got half of his resources to begin with, and then he pays them back 4-fold, at least that's how it's always struck me. But there was a guy there, Zacchaeus, who really evidenced a penitent spirit when he met Jesus. But godly sorrow also results in changed behavior. Changed behavior. One of the new guys that was on our Kairos team this time, a Kairos member, is a guy named Brian Thomas. Now, Brian Thomas is also on staff at the Oceans United Church in Vero Beach. I've just seen it in years past when I'd be out there at the mall there off of State Route 60. I guess they rent part of that mall out, Oceans United Church. Brian Thomas is on staff there. So this is the first time, that he'd been on our Kairos team. But the interesting thing about Brian is, even though he's an ordained minister, his first introduction to Kairos was about 15 to 20 years ago on the receiving end of it. He did some time in prison, Okeechobee and Martin. So here's an evidence of a life that was changed, and that's how godly sorrow works. It results in changed behavior. But fourthly, godly sorrow leads to salvation. Worldly sorrow leads to death. Paul says in our text, verses 11 and 13, he says, "See what this godly sorrow has produced in you. What earnestness, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what concern, what readiness to see justice done. At every point you have proved yourselves to be innocent in this matter. By all this we are encouraged." Now when you think about this thing of godly sorrow versus worldly sorrow, the ultimate example would have to be Judas and Peter. They were both sorry for what they did. But in the case of Judas, he didn't want to change his life. He just committed suicide. In the case of Peter, he repented for denying the Lord. The Lord reinstated him. He was forgiven, and he went on. That's an example of godly versus worldly sorrow. So Paul was encouraged by these Corinthians, godly sorrow that led to life. But our third and final point, and we're just about done here, is the Corinthians encouraged Titus, One person encourages the next, and it's like a circle. The Corinthians encouraged Titus. Now, Paul encouraged the church, Titus encouraged Paul, and the Corinthians encouraged Titus. Look at what we read in verse 13 of our text. It says, "In addition to our own encouragement," Paul wrote, "we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was, because his spirit has been refreshed by all of you." His spirit has been refreshed by all of you. Now, you might not think about it, but Titus really had a tough task. Imagine you're the guy that has to take this letter that Paul has written about these people, and exactly what the situation was, we can't be certain, but it could be that there were people in that church, whether they be from the outside or whatever, who basically were saying about Paul that, Paul is not the real deal. Paul can't be trusted. Paul's not a real apostle or whatever. But somebody was trying to perhaps disparage Paul. So Paul is sending a letter to try to set things straight. And you have to be the guy that delivers that letter. And in the case of Titus 2,000 years ago, you can't just drop it in the mailbox and leave. You got to hand deliver it and see how they received it. That could be a bit of a daunting task. But that's what Titus was up against. And he didn't know exactly how he'd be received. But we read in verse 14, Paul writes, it says, "I had boasted to him," that is to Titus, "about you, and you have not embarrassed me." Just imagine bragging about somebody to a friend of yours. This guy is great, you need to meet this guy. And then the two guys finally meet him. Perhaps you're a little anxious, Is this guy going to live up to the expectations that I just told this guy, or is he going to embarrass me? Same thing's true with Paul. Paul probably told Titus, these Corinthians, they got their problems, but I believe they're going to do what's right. They're going to accept you, and things are going to be okay. But, when Paul gives this letter to Titus, Titus has to deliver and see how things, turn out. It's not like today where he could just make a phone call or send him a text message and say, "Hey, things turned out okay." It could be weeks before the two of them would meet again. And so Paul is just wondering, what kind of reception did he get? And yet things did turn out well, Things turned out well. Now, in verses 15 and 16 of our passage, Paul wrote concerning Titus, it says, "His affection for you is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient, receiving him with fear and trembling. I am glad I can have complete confidence in you." That was the reception Titus received. And that encouraged Paul when Titus and Paul got back together. But that kind of, brings us to our final thought. as we wind this message down. And that would be this. When a Christian has made a bad mistake, okay, we have the responsibility not only to forgive them, but to try to encourage them. And we've had lots of Christians in the past, we can all think of them, who've made bad mistakes. One example would be Jim Baker, PTL Club, back in the 80s. I mean, this guy basically lost his ministry when it was revealed that he had an affair with his church secretary, Jessica Hahn. And then, the federal government got after him and his ministry because there were some things going on there that shouldn't have been going on. And so Jim ends up going to prison for almost 5 years. 5 years. And one of the guys that really encouraged Jim Baker back then, Jim Baker says this himself, was Billy Graham. He says, Billy Graham came into my prison when I was there. He wrapped his arms around me when I was a mess. I was cleaning toilets at that moment, and I was at a very low point in my life, Baker said, as he was choking back tears. He says, Billy Graham came in, threw his arms around me, and said, Jim, I love you. Jim, I love you. Imagine that. And when you think about people in the New Testament, perhaps the premier example of that would be a guy named Barnabas. That name Barnabas, you probably know, means son of encouragement. And Paul had his opportunity to be encouraged because Paul was originally a person that fought against the church, its chief enemy, you might say, prior to his becoming a Christian. And yet when the church heard that Paul was now one of them, understandably, they were apprehensive about it. Maybe this is just a ruse to try to get in and capture and kill more of us. But Barnabas was willing to go to bat for Paul and say, hey, he's for real. We can trust him. Bottom line is, we too need to become sons of encouragement, just like Barnabas was in Paul's life. We should be encouragers as well. So with that, let's go ahead and stand as we have our hymn of invitation. Our hymn of invitation as we stand. If you need to make a decision for the Lord, we want to give you that opportunity right now. Just come forward and let us know.